Okay, just gonna give it another minute of letting folks in.
Okay.
Okay, it doesn't look like anybody else. Oh, just as I say that, there's one more. I am going to go ahead and get started. So today's our Women Owning Woodland virtual donor lunch. Today I'm talking about invasives that are good to treat this time of year. And we choose this time of year because a lot of our native species are in their dormancy, and our invasives tend to come out earlier than the natives, which is one of those things that makes the invasive so good and so invasive, is because they are opportunistic and they start sucking up resources before our natives even come out of dormancy. And so if we can treat them now, we won't have as much adverse effects on our natives that are around them. And we'll also get that jump start on treating them and, kind of make sure they're not stealing stuff from our native species. So just if you're unfamiliar with the Women Owning Woodland program, it is one that I keep saying it's in development. I really should just say that it is, a program that we have, because we are pretty excitingly well into the program and having folks join us. So we organize field days, lunch and learns, and classes that are geared towards our women forest landowners and woodland enthusiasts. But there's Facebook. There's a lot of information on there that gets shared. Sometimes it's stuff that I've shared on our natural resources Facebook page, and I've just kind of copied and shared over there. But I also do try to share our women-centric opportunities that we have around the state on that Facebook page as well. I don't have a list of upcoming events because I'm kind of hitting a quick lull in my schedule as far as things that I have planned around the state, and then I should kick back off in April. So I'm working on getting some things on the calendar. Next week, if you are in the Rolla, Phelps County area or surrounding counties, we are doing an invasive species workshop at Merrimack Springs. It's a full day, so morning will kind of be classroom piece, have lunch, and then we're going to let folks get have a chance to do some hands-on invasive control and identification. And that is me plus our agronomy specialist from the area and our horticulture specialist, as well as an invasive species coordinator that we have from Pheasants Forever, Quail Forever. So it should be a good time. But after that workshop, I'm kind of taking a small break, and then I will restart kind of planning other events. Sometimes it takes a little bit of downtime to get all the events put together. So invasive identification and control. An invasive species is an aggressive, non-native species whose presence causes or is likely to cause economic harm, environmental harm, or harm to human health. So not all species that are not native to Missouri become invasive. So things like, I always use examples of like petunias or impatiens. Those are very common flowers for us to find at the garden store that we, plant in our landscape beds, and they do not escape and cause any harm to our native ecosystem. So they're annuals. They don't have the capability of really getting out of control. And so those are not considered invasive species. So it has to be aggressive and take over and cause harm to us as well. Identifying invasives early can help with control. So the sooner we can identify them and start the management process, there's sometimes like we can catch honeysuckle in its early stages on our property. It actually pulls out of the ground very easily. So this can help with a lot of long-term angst of trying to remove established invasives. And then controlling invasives may require several different tools. And this is sometimes the hardest part to talk about, because In some cases, chemical control is one of our only options for really effectively controlling an invasive. And this is sometimes just not in someone's toolbox that they want to use. And I understand that. So we do try to give as many options as possible when we talk about controlling. But there are some that their numbers have become so overwhelming, or they've become so well established that a chemical treatment is about the only way to really truly eradicate them from our property or environment. So the first one we're going to talk about today is reed canary grass. And so this is one that will start to green up and show up kind of early in the spring. And it is a larger, coarser grass that it can get quite high, so up to 9 feet tall. It has hairless and hollow stems that are rounded, and the leaves have a really rough texture to them, and they are about 1/4 to 1/3 inch in width. So they're not ginormous wide grasses, but they are, again, quite tall and pretty prominent. They also have this prominent, highly transparent membrane at the junction of the leaf sheath and the blade. And I have some pictures to kind of help with that. So here's, again, grasses are my least favorite because identification of them is sometimes complicated and difficult. But here's, again, just some examples. Again, the hollow stem helps. If you look here, you can see this is that sheath that was discussed on the previous slide. And then looking at the seed heads. So, and if you're uncertain about if something is reed canary grass, I have no shame in passing this one along, but you have agronomists we have agronomists that serve every county in Missouri, and they are super at identifying grasses. And so if you have this and you have a grass you're uncertain of that seems to look like reed canary grass, you can take pictures and email them. You can find the agronomists on the extension webpage, but I'm going to put that plug in there because I'm happy to also look and help identify pictures, but the agronomy specialists are, there's more of them than me, and they are really grass experts. I'm controlling this. So if you can catch this one early and you cut it at ground level when it's getting, when it's flowering but not seeded, this can provide some control and help prevent spreading of this grass. We found that prescribed fire on this one, it needs to be repeated on a regular basis, but it will control reed canary grass over time. You can also do kind of a mixture, so what we call integrated pest management, and it also refers to our management of invasive species. And we promote integrated pest management because one, we found when we use, again, just a strictly chemical control, that sometimes plants, and when we talk about insects, they will build resistance to those particular chemicals. And so the use of kind of all the different methods kind of helps us prevent those future resistances being built, or at least slows down that process. So for this one, you can use kind of a combination of prescribed fire and chemical and foliar. And you can also integrate that mechanical, as far as like, this is a pretty inexpensive, fast way. I know that this year, especially, the cost of herbicides is quite high. So looking at some of those other mechanisms for this year in particular, but just also for the future, can also help, again, to slow the spread. And most of us that work in invasive species management, promotional control, we really understand that it's not always possible for us to eradicate invasive species, but if we can at least manage it and control it so it has a smaller effect on our native species, that's what we're going to try and do. So for this one, again, cultural, like prescribed fire repeatedly might be the best choice. You can speed up the eradication of it by using herbicide in addition to the prescribed fire. And so this again is a good time is in early spring before your other native species begin to emerge. And then you can, so if you mow or burn and then do the herbicide application when it starts to have new growth this time of year. So we're gonna like hit it back with that fire or mowing. Also helps remove thatch, which might pull from your herbicide treatment. And then again, we can retreat it. Japanese stiltgrass is another one that this time of year is good for treating. This is a sprawling annual grass that really likes to take up residence in our riparian areas. And so the leaves are short with these smooth edges and a notable silvery midrib. Again, I have a picture to show you. They have flowers and fruits that are on this very thin spike that comes up a very kind of delicate stem is the description. In the fall, the tops of the plant will turn purple or brown, giving this one of its other common names, which is Nepalese's brown top. And then in winter, the thatch is a distinct bright tan to orange color. So this time of year is again, a good time to go out and identify it because it turns that bright tan orange color. And then if we can hit early spring treatment, we can catch this one again before our natives emerge. And so here's just kind of some examples of what it looks like when it's, summer, early spring, what it looks like. And then this is kind of what you would see this time of year down here in that right hand corner is that very tannish, orangish, very thick. So if it invades an area, it is a very thick grass. You can see here that it has these very sprawling outreaches, which is what creates this very thick thatch on it. Again, these roots are very shallow. And so if you find that you don't have very many of them, you can pull them and kind of get a start on. Fortunately, it also tends to grow very fast and be a pretty effective invader. So sometimes we may not see it one time of year, come back and it has, taken over a place. So you can also mow or weed whip, otherwise known as weed eating. So if you find that you can do this late in the season, but before the plants flower, that's a good mechanical treatment, especially to slow the spread down. This one can be treated with prescribed fire. However, so you saw all the thatch that it makes. So unfortunately, when we put a prescribed fire through it, this is going to kill back the established plants, but we see a flush of germination because we've freed up the resources for that seed bank to take over. And so, but if you have those very thick thatches like you saw before, running a fire through there, then if you have a flush from the seed bank, you can come back and easily pull. If it's a small area, you can easily pull those plants that make a comeback. Or if you want to use a chemical method, you can go back and also treat those new plants then easier with a chemical foliar treatment. It is a grass, so you're going to need to use a grass-specific herbicide. So Sethoxidum or Clethodim, they are some of the better ones to use on it because some of our non selective ones that are for broadleaf aren't going to work on our grasses. The next one's Himalayan blackberry. So this is one that it is a blackberry, and it will have canes and some somewhat green leaves this time of year. They are what we consider somewhat evergreen. So some will turn brown and die back over the winter, but they will keep some leaves at all times, meaning that they have a receptacle for chemical treatment if that's what we want to use. These also Himalayan blackberry will start to create new leaves and flower out a little bit earlier than our native blackberry species. And this is one that once it's in, it's hard to treat because it has really stout canes that are filled with very sharp thorns on them. So it can be hard to manage. but it forms these dense thickets. I know, I'll show you some pictures to try and help distinguish it from our native blackberry, but a lot of the distinguishing characters, the canes grow so much larger than ours and so much taller than our native species, that's usually indicative of Himalayan blackberry. I'll let you know that in the Dent, Texas, if anybody's joining me from that part of the world, we have had several infestations of Himalayan blackberry in those areas. So if you're thinking, oh, I might have it, and you're in that area, there's a good chance of it. So, and here's again what it looks like, very thorny, and it has a very ridged canes to it. So it has a lot of ridges to it. If you get to the berry point, which I know is not spring, the berries also tend to be larger than our native blackberries, and they look more like almost like a commercial blackberry that you would find, which has enticed some people to keep them, but they do have, again, very large thorns, and because they are like rhizome rooters, they can spread pretty far and pretty quickly. So blackberry can be controlled by digging, mowing, herbicide, plowing, and our livestock grazing. However, cows will not graze on this one, but goats will. So you can, if you can, especially if it's very established, it's sometimes hard to get a brush hog in there, but if you can remove the top growth through mowing, cutting, or grazing, this will eventually kill that blackberry if it's done over a regular period of time. So these blackberries work just like horticultural blackberries, but also like our native blackberries. So they will put, they usually kind of have a 2 cane system. So 1 cane is the new growth for the year. And then the second year cane is the one that puts off flowers and fruit. So they're just kind of constantly, each year they put up a new set of canes that's going to be the next year's flowers and fruit. So if you can slow them down by cutting back like those first year canes, then you're going to, again, slow down their spread. You should, if you want to use with herbicides, you can, but the product labels should be followed carefully because different products need to be used at different times. And they may, again, pose different risks at different times of the year. But you can use triclopyr, glyphosate, and metsulfurin, which are some of our more common herbicides that you find. All of these are foliar active chemicals, and so you would apply them to the leaves. So again, this time of year is a good time to do that because foliar applications tend to be a little bit not as concise as like a cut stem application. And so if you have a little bit of drift from your foliar application, it is not going to kill native species that are in the area because they have not come out of dormancy yet. The next one's the Japanese chaff flower. It is a perennial herb, and it gets, again, quite tall, up to 3 to 6 feet. It begins growing in spring and flowers in late July. This one sometimes it's easy to identify by its bottle brush flower, which we sometimes don't see in the spring. But it's also something to be on the lookout as we go into summer, spring into summer. Oh, I guess I didn't give, this one is a fairly new one. I don't have a lot of pictures of it. So, but it is one to be on the lookout for. The next ones are my most common invasive species. And I joke that any time of year is really a good time to do war with them. However, again, this time of year, they tend to stand out because they start growing earlier, or, they perhaps have kind of so this is autumn olive, which they tend to have, they're not evergreen, but they do leaf out very early. And so it is pretty much across the entire state of Missouri, but it is a woody shrub, it's a nitrogen fixer, which, we've always heard that it's actually a good thing to put more nitrogen into the soil. However, our native plants are not used to having so much nitrogen in the soil. that autumn olive actually changes the soil chemical components, which makes it infertile to some of our native plants because they're not used to that amount of nitrogen. So this makes it, again, very aggressive because it will outcompete and threaten native species in there. And this one tends to be on the edges of woods and fields. It kind of grows in open sunlight. If you've done any timber management that's opened up forest floors, this one sometimes will make its way into those areas as well. It's what we call tardily deciduous, meaning that it is going to be leaf out early, but it also will lose its leaves later than the other ones. And it forms kind of this bushy shrub. And one of the distinguishing characteristics, again, it's not as helpful in the spring when they're just kind of putting the leaves on, but they have very silvery undersides to the leaves. And when they kind of blow in the wind, it has a very silvery appearance to it. For this one, they do establish really deep roots that make it hard to pull them mechanically. If you try to go that route, it might require some heavy machinery. Fire, unfortunately, unless it's a very hot fire, which then can have some detriment to some of our native species, it doesn't seem to knock them back because they are, again, very prolific root sprouters. So we can, even with prescribed fire, if it's a light prescribed fire like we usually try to utilize, it will kill off the top, but then we will have root sprouts by the next year. So for this one, unfortunately, chemical treatment is usually the best option. And this time of year, again, is kind of a good time if you're going to do the foliar treatment, but also a good time of year for basal bark treatment. Until we get to later spring when the sap is really flowing, then you might want to not do cut stump, but do foliar for this one. So again, this can be treated with a 2 to 4% glyphosate water solution, and that can be sprayed directly on the leaves to kill it back. If you don't want to do foliar, you can do basal bark. And I think I just misspoke a few minutes ago, but for basal bark, that can be done springtime as well without too many concerns about the sap flow. But it's the cut stump where we cut the shrub off and then apply herbicide to the stump. This time, we're not quite there yet, but late March, April, May, we have a lot of sap flow in our woody species. And so that will push the glyphosate out, and we won't have as good of a kill rate with that method. The other one is bush honeysuckles. So again, these are ones that will be leafing out. And some, if it's a vining honeysuckle or vining Japanese honeysuckle, they still have their leaves. They haven't lost them. So again, if you're going to do a foliar treatment, it's a good time of year to do that. We don't like the honeysuckles because they do kind of interfere with our native wildlife's kind of ecology. So if you've ever seen bush honeysuckle, it can get very thick in an understory very quickly. And it chokes out a lot of our native understory species, and so places that birds would nest in that understory level, they'll be tempted to nest in honeysuckle, and it is lower to the ground. It's not as sturdy as like a dogwood or a redbud, for example, which leaves them more inclined to higher nest predation. And the other thing is it does produce berries in the fall that birds do eat, which is one of the reasons that honeysuckle has truly spread as fast as it has, because they have done a great job distributing it all across the US. However, it does not provide any nutritional value for them. And so it's kind of like them eating an M&M, and they aren't gaining a lot of nutrition that will help them. So again, this time of year, we'll start to see this greening up, and they tend to flower like super early, it feels like, before most of our natives are even like fully leafed out. They're starting to put flowers on. It is a fairly upright spreading shrub. It can get anywhere up to 15 to 20 feet tall. It has opposite simple leaves. So when you look at the stems, the leaves come out of the stem directly across from each other, giving it the opposite. So, and again, this is not an uncommon sight, unfortunately, in some of our Missouri woods this time of year. So our trees have not leafed out yet, but our honeysuckle has underneath there. And again, it's a good time if you're going to use a foliar treatment on it. It is a good time to do that type of spraying. Flowers, again, these are usually later spring, early summer. Fruits, again, we're not at fruits yet, but if you know, it's always good to know what it looks like at all stages. Management, so again, these guys are pretty shallow, so if you catch them early enough, you can pull them from the ground, especially during the spring, because it seems like we have spring rain, which keeps our soil fairly moist throughout this season, and you can pull those plants out. You can also use a grubbing tool for some of the larger ones. But if it's very established, you know, like, and my parents live in suburban St. Charles, and I actually can remember like pretty distinctly the spread and evolution of honeysuckle through their neighborhood. And so if they catch it early enough, like in flower beds and such, they can pull it. But they have some plants that have probably been established for 20 plus years, and they do have a fairly deep root system, making them harder to pull. And so there's some other treatment methods for those guys. Prescribed fire will kill seedlings, but generally not our large plants. So again, they have the capability to root sprout. And so if we kill the top of the plant, they'll leave the roots, which happens a lot of times with fire. It doesn't kill them back enough, and they will root sprout from that and come back. Chemical, so these guys do die pretty easily with the treatment of glyphosate. So that would be, again, Roundup is our typical brand of glyphosate, but we can do a 2 to 4% mixture of glyphosate and water and spray that on the foliage this time of year. You can also treat them with the basil bark treatment. So if this is a mixture of herbicide with what we call basil oil, and that oil is just to kind of help it stick to the stem. So this time of year is also effective for that. Cut stump, again, not recommended this time of year as the sap flow starts. But those other ones are great choices. Calorie Bradford pear. I put this on my list because it won't be long, and they will be flowering. So it's a good time to get rid of them before they flower or produce seed. But they do unfortunately spread quite quickly by vegetative means, meaning that they put some root sprouts out, which is what helps them form such dense thickets if they've been in an area for a long period of time. They also will leaf out earlier, which helps with identification. And then again, some of those negative impacts is it shades out our native spring wildflowers that need, so, you know, our trees and our plants like wildflowers and other shrubs, they've co-evolved, they've grown together. And so a lot of our trees do not leaf out until a certain time of spring, which gives our native wildflowers a chance to get that sunlight while they're, you know, putting off their vegetation and flowering, and then our trees leaf out. So they are utilizing that period of warmth and sunlight to do their wildflower thing, and then our trees leaf out. But when the calorie pear leaves out so much earlier, this is going to shade those wildflowers out, and they're not going to be as successful. So also just, you know, these guys, when they flower out, which they tend to be one of our early flowers. So typically for our natives, we kind of have a cycle of flowering trees in the woods that start, it probably won't be very long until we start to see serviceberry is usually our first white flower, and these guys will start to flower around the same time as serviceberry. And so that's kind of our earliest one. And then if you're curious, it's usually serviceberry, followed by dogwoods, followed by redbuds is kind of our cycle of flowering. And there's some other flowering trees that are out there, but those are the ones that really light up the forest in springtime. These guys usually stay a medium to small size tree. There's a lot of cultivars, which is what really contributed to its invasiveness. So Callery pear was introduced with the idea of it being it was first thought of that it could be a grafting tree for like commercial pear production. So fruit that we like buy at the grocery store. Oftentimes they like to find a really hardy root system and then graft certain varieties of a fruit tree to those hardy root systems. And so this was kind of started with that, and then it was developed into a landscape tree because of its flowering and its shape that it has. And the first Callery Bradford pears were sterile, and so they weren't able to spread. But then so many cultivars were developed that they did start to cross-pollinate. And then the other thing they didn't really account for is its ability to reproduce vegetatively, so to put off new trees off its root system. Again, this one's found a lot of times in our urban areas. This is an exit ramp off 270 in St. Louis. And all of this is unfortunately Bradford pear. And this is kind of the areas it likes, these marginal areas. It does okay in poor soils. It does like sun. So we don't have a whole lot of instances of Callery pear kind of taking over the understory of a thick forest, but they will utilize the edge. They also tolerate drought, which is why they kind of do well in these marginal areas as well. The twigs, so if you look at, and this is a tree that is still actually available for sale at your local Lowe's, Home Depot, any type of, a lot of our kind of hardware stores that also have nurseries will still sell Callery pear. It's still legal. And so in those cultivated varieties, the twigs are thornless. But when you start looking and finding wild type trees, they will actually have the end of their branches. So these are modified twigs essentially, but they are a thorn. So they actually have a very sharp point to them. And that's usually, again, this indicates kind of a wild type that has escaped. The leaves are alternate, simple, and they have this like oval shape to them. Again, these are some of the characteristics that made them so popular as a landscape tree. Is the way their stem is, they bob in the wind, which again appeals to some folks for landscaping trees. They turn a pretty color in the fall, so it's usually a glossy color that goes into some orange, reds, pinks, and purples. So again, they are attractive for those reasons, unfortunately, which made them very popular and allowed them to escape like they have. They do flower very early in the spring. They have these white clusters of flowers. And I should throw up, the next time I do this presentation, I'll throw up a picture because they get mistaken sometimes for apple trees, which their flower does look similar to a cultivated apple tree. They also sometimes get mistaken for some of our other natives that'll be flowering. One of those is our native plum trees. And so next time I do this, I'll throw up some of those other flowers. But the one thing that is definitely distinct about Callery pear and their flowers is they smell terrible. So our native like plums, serviceberry, that might be kind of mistaken for this one, they smell very pleasant. Callery pear smells like dead fish is the smell that comes off of it. And this is one of the reasons it's actually very most of its pollinator action is flies, because they are attracted to that unpleasant scent. And so they get pollinated pretty heavily and attract a lot of flies in the spring. And the fruits, so I work out of our Phelps County courthouse here in Phelps County. And our courthouse is actually surrounded by calorie pear as an ornamental that's been planted in our landscaping. And I was looking at today, and it actually still has a lot of these, essentially they're the pear part. They're still on a lot of our trees here. So I guess the birds found enough to eat that they did not have to rely on the Bradford pears to get through the winter. So it tends to be very hard and unpalatable in the fall, but after it goes through a couple of freeze thaw cycles, it does become more palatable and birds will eat it, which also does spread it. A management of this one, and if you are in a suburban urban area, they do have, so MDC's partnered with Grow Native, and they have offered some like, if you bring in proof that you cut down a calorie pear, they'll give you a native tree. Unfortunately, it's not entirely across the entire state. They tend to be in the more suburban areas with that offer. But something to look out for this time of year. And unfortunately, so calorie pear, if we cut it down completely, which would be essentially our mechanical treatment of it, it does tend to be a good stump sprouter. And so it will put up sprouts again. If you were to continually kind of cut those sprouts back every single year, the tree itself would probably eventually die because it would run out of resources. So in that way, you could use a mechanical treatment. It's a little bit faster if you do cut it and then treat that stump. And then this time of year, if they are small trees, so I know, again, by the time we realize some of them are there, they're oftentimes quite large, making foliar treatments a little bit difficult. But this is a good time of year for basil bark treatment, which will kill it back. And then, kind of by the end of summer, we can cut that tree down if it's in our yard landscape area. But then cut stump treatment later in the year after the initial sap flow is a good treatment as well. And then my last one of today is multiflora rose. So these are ones again that are kind of semi-evergreen. So they tend to keep leaves on through the winter, just not all of the leaves. And then they'll start to put on, in fact, I looked at some around my house and our multiflora is already putting new leaves on. So this makes it a good time to treat it with a foliar treatment. And so this is, it's pretty invasive as far as it spreads quickly, it root sprouts. It kind of forms these really large like thicket of multiflora, which is again not great for us going through our property, but also not great for wildlife utilizing our property. It was unfortunately very widely planted in the early 1900s. So it was planted as a food source for wildlife. They thought it might create habitat. Also marketed as what we consider a living fence. And the idea was that you would plant multiflora rows in place of barbed wire, which if it, always grew as fast as it could, it would potentially act as a living fence. But unfortunately, it escaped into our woods and has become a nuisance invasive species to us. Again, they can get quite tall. They can climb up, so they'll vine up trees to a certain extent, kind of form large clumps. They have a pinnately compound leaf with lots of recurved and straight thorns on them. Probably, again, like early May, they will start to put off their white flowers, and then red rose hips in the fall, and that will last through the winter. And these rose hips are the seed portion, and also what wildlife tends to eat. So again, just a look at those thorns, and then a look at these leaf branches that we see here. So, and these tend to go to a reddish color in winter. The bark will stay brown or green if it's younger branches. And then there's those flowers. And we do have a native rose called Carolina rose. And it tends not to be as, it doesn't form as dense of clusters. Its flowers are more, I use the term delicate, but it usually puts off just one flower in an area, and it has kind of like a nice open flower, not these bunches of flowers like we see on multiflora. So then there's those rose hips. Again, they're usually July to December, but they do help us identify the rose during winter months, especially. Mechanical treatment. So you can mechanically treat these and cut them back, but one, it can be hard to remove them, especially if they're quite large stands, clusters of them. It can be difficult with their thorns. And then also we need to still grub out the rest of the roots after that. And that can be, again, difficult when dealing with thorns. Prescribed fire will kill the stems and may kill seedlings, but some of our older plants are likely to resprout from roots with this. And so, again, this one's one of those ones that it does respond pretty well to integrated management. So running a fire through can help kind of knock back the plant, making it easier for us to treat a smaller resprouting plant with an herbicide. So again, this time of year is a good time for foliar treatment. And again, kind of that same 2 to 4% glyphosate in water, or you can use a 1 to 2% triclopyr mix. You can also treat these guys with a basal bark treatment, which when they grow in clumps, it's sometimes very, it can be a lot. So because you want to spray that basal bark treatment around the entirety of the stem. And so if you have lots and lots of multiple stems coming off the ground, it can be quite time consuming to treat it that way. You can also do a cut stump method for multiflora rose. Again, kind of like basal bark, it can be quite time consuming if you're cutting a lot of like clumps of stems and then trying to treat all of those as you go. And of course, this time of year, we have a little bit of sap flow. These guys don't tend to have as much sap flow as like our like woody tree species, but they do have some. Okay, I haven't even looked at the clock, so hopefully I did not go over. Nope, 12:43. Any questions today?
Hi there. I have a lot of Japanese honeysuckle, more of the vining kind of thing.
Yes.
And can you use the cut stump kind of procedure on that this time of year?
You can. Say they tend to not have quite as much sap flow as some of our, again, larger woodier species. And now is a really good time for identification because they still have their leaves on. And so if we can treat, identify them and cut them and then do a little bit of herbicide treatment, it is a good way to kill them, especially before they start putting on a lot of new growth that takes over even more. So, yep. Good time to treat them. I should say we have a native honeysuckle. And there are some other ornamental that are not as invasive as our Japanese and bush honeysuckle. But we do actually have a native honeysuckle that is quite, it's called trumpet honeysuckle, and I'm just going to show you a picture. So if you're looking for something to replace your Japanese honeysuckle with, here, I'll share this picture. Oh, like that. Can you see this one? So there's some pink trumpety looking flowers. That is actually coral honeysuckle or native trumpet honeysuckle. And it is beautiful and a great replacement. So, and I always like to promote this time of year because all the native plant sales are starting to be announced. So it's a good time if you're trying to replace any of the invasive species with something native.
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
We have, in the past couple of years, we've lived here for 16 years and never had this issue, but we're getting something that my husband calls broom sage. It comes up about 2 foot tall. Yeah. And it's sprouting up just about everywhere on the property for some reason.
So sometimes it's just sometimes soil will affect broom sedge and how it pops up. It is one that can be treated. I think I'm going to try and look. I think we have an extension handout on broom sedge. So, and it talks a little bit about using lime and phosphorus to limit it. But it is actually a native warm season grass. It's just not very, we don't love it because it has kind of invasive nature to it. I'm going to put this to hand. This is from the Missouri Ag Connection about broom sedge. What county are you in? Because also a lot of our agronomists.
I'm in Ripley County.
In Ripley, okay.
Ripley County.
Okay. So you're over. So yeah, and I can give you. They do help a lot. Our agronomists can help a lot with broom sedge. Here's also a little bit of information. It is native, unfortunately, just has invasive tendencies.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Oh, thanks, Tabitha. Yeah, you gave us some information too. Any other questions today? I was going to say next week will be spring flower identification. So we'll talk about the good plants to be looking for this time of year. And then March 21st, Katie Candler is she's actually going to fill in for me on that day, but she's going to talk about planting native plants. So if you're hitting any of these native plant sales, she will talk about ones to look for that are easy to grow and kind of how to take care of them. And then March 28th, which unfortunately I've already heard someone say they found their first tick of the season. But we'll talk about poison plants to watch out for in the woods and other pests such as ticks to look out for. So I don't know where everybody else is, but I was kind of sad to wake up to freezing temperatures this morning, kind of enjoying our spring warm up. All right. So without snow, slush, and ice. Sorry, Tabitha. I know we're supposed to get up to 3 inches of snow on Friday, which again, not really looking forward to it. But it is springtime in Missouri. So it's always a change. All right. I will see you all next week. Have a good rest of the week.